Hello and welcome to Ways to Change the World. I'm Krishnan Murthy, and this is the podcast in which we talk to extraordinary people about the big ideas in their lives and the events that have helped shape them. My guest this week is Sir Roger Penrose, an extraordinary mathematician and theoretical physicist. He has won the Nobel Prize for physics, even though maths was his first discipline, and all sorts of other honors. He has been portrayed in the movies and is at least partly responsible for that famous MC Escher drawing of an impossible ascending and descending staircase.
One of our lecturers had in his hand a catalogue. It had this picture on the outside, Escher's picture with the birds going into the night and the day. And I thought, that's amazing. I'd like to try and do something impossible. So I fiddled around with roads and bridges. And then I simplified it to this thing which became known as the tribar. And I showed my father this picture. And then he produced this staircase going round and round. And Escher developed the staircase into his ascending and descending. But anyway, this was the influence that I'd had on Escher. He had a big influence on me too.
So Roger, welcome to Ways to Change the World. It's a delight to have you on.
My pleasure.
Now, one of the more sort of relaxing things I have read about you is that you were not straightforwardly top of the class at school.
During the war years, this was in 1940, I was at a school in Canada. I spent the war years in Canada. And I remember I was in a class which contained, I think, high grade 2 and low grade 3. I was in low grade 3. And the teacher, she had a sort of mental arithmetic thing. You had to add something and multiply, and that you had to do it in your head one after the other. And I got lost, always got lost with these things. I was much too slow. And she moved me down from low grade 3 into high grade 2. Some of my colleagues were very puzzled that I was in that group, but I think she was just trying to get rid of me, which was probably well, because she was just a teacher I couldn't get on with. Later on, I had a teacher who was much more understanding. This was Mr. Stinnett. And he realized I didn't do terribly well in the maths exams. So he realized I was just very slow. And he let me, the next test, he allowed me to go all the way through the period and in fact sit through the next period, which was a play period. I could watch people outside playing and I was rather envious of it. But since I could take all the time I needed, it was clear that it was not that I was stupid. It was just that I had to think it all through myself.
Because I think a lot of people will take some comfort from that. I mean, was that something, the way you thought, the way you learned, that was also in other subjects, or was that just maths?
I think it applied particularly to maths. I mean, other subjects I wasn't necessarily very good at. So I don't think it was so clear what the problem was there. I guess I was never particularly good at arithmetic because it was just remembering your tables and things like that, which that wasn't my skill. And I did things sort of off topic at home with my father. You see, we used to make polyhedra and various complicated things like this. And this was something I enjoyed very much.
And I wondered, has that affected at all the way you think about exams as a way of judging children?
Does in a way, yes. It's difficult to know. I don't know the answer. I think there's a problem both ways. There's a problem with exams because the skill to do well in exams is really rather different from the skill in understanding your subject. But then how else do you do it? I mean, if you do it on teacher assessment, then that has its pitfalls as well. I think a combination of the two is probably the best way.
Yes, and it's sort of where we've ended up, partly because of the pandemic.
That's true. Yes, it certainly has had a strange effect on education. That's true.
So when did you work out that maths was your thing, that this was something you had a special talent for?
It wasn't true for a long time. When I was at school in England, back in England after the war, I remember we had to decide which topics to do in the final 2 years at school. And I was the one in the family who my parents considered was going to follow their careers and become a doctor. Both my parents were medically trained. Well, anyway, each of us had to go up to see the headmaster. And so he asked me, what did I want to do? Biology, chemistry, and mathematics. And he said, no, you can't do that combination. If you want to do biology, you can't do mathematics. If you want to do mathematics, you can't do biology. Make your choice. So I said mathematics, physics, and chemistry. And there was my medical career down the tubes. And my parents were furious with me.
Well, that's quite pleasing, actually. I did maths, chemistry, and biology in my last 2 years of school because I was also supposed to be a medic, and
Really?
disappointed my parents no end by not doing it and becoming a journalist instead. But I suppose these days, when we're used to thinking of maths as something that we should try and encourage our kids. Speaking as a parent, to try and do because of computing, I suppose, and because of technology. When you were becoming a mathematician, what did you think maths was going to lead you to? I mean, how did you think you were going to change the world decades ago?
I don't think I did think that, but you see, at the time I was just doing what interested me.
How important do you think it is that the general public understands more about these sorts of concepts?
At one point I had this view that I would write a popular-ish book. And in the process of writing my book, I would learn about neurophysiology and therefore learn how the sort of ideas that I thought must be relevant to how you get around being a computer basically was to incorporate what we call the collapse of the wave function. Nobody really knew what to do about it, but it seemed to me this was a crucial central question. So that in my book, I tried to address this question as best I could. Would this be of any relevance in the brain? So I knew about neurophysiology and I learned about the Huxley-Hodgkin transmission of nerves. And it seemed to me there's no hope because the nerve signals, as it goes along the nerve, it gets the environment all mixed up, the electric fields or spread through the brain. There's no way of getting the kind of isolation you would need in order to take advantage of this missing part of physics. That's the collapse of the wave function. I still had the view, but I didn't see how it would work. But then Stuart Hameroff, who was an anesthesiologist in the United States, and he wrote back to me and said, look, I found your book interesting, but you evidently don't know about microtubules, which I didn't. And I thought, look, this is much, much more promising. There are structures in the brain which really have a chance of preserving the kind of coherence you would need in order that this collapse of the wave function be harnessed in a way that could be made use of in getting around this computational straitjacket, if you like, the straitjacket of what computers do, and being that universe, according to this kind of view, is entirely computation that works according to computers. In my views, that can't be right. There's got to be something else going on.
And so this is the difference between computing and the human brain, which is consciousness.
Yes, that's right, exactly. So that was the focus of the book. I realized that had to be the focus. Up to that point, I didn't really think that. I just thought it'd be nice to have a book which describes exciting things in science to people at perhaps a little bit of a deeper level than people usually get.
So what do you think consciousness is?
Well, is perhaps is a tricky word. You see, when you go back to the early people who worried about quantum mechanics, these are great physicists, people like von Neumann and Wigner, who was a very interesting physicist, and he had this sort of idea, but it's the conscious observer that collapses the wave function. So this was the kind of view that people tended to have, even if not explicitly saying it, that when wave function collapses when you make a measurement. So you see the Schrödinger equation chugs away and your system evolves, but then you make a measurement on the system and then it collapses the wave function. So that's the sort of view that people had about quantum mechanics. And what is a measurement? So people say, oh, well, somebody comes along and looks at it. So you're measuring it by observing it. Now, you see, that was a sort of view people had, that somehow the consciousness is making the measurement or making the collapse. My view was basically the opposite. I mean, this is giving a sort of external, unexplained conscious thing, or whatever it is, that's observing something from outside, but it's giving no explanation as to what that thing is. Is that part of the world or is it an outside? But my view is no, it's the other way around. That there is a physical process which collapses the wave function, which is not immediately anything to do with consciousness. It's more to do with gravity and how gravity combines with general relativity. So the view I had was that it was when gravity and quantum mechanics come together, that's when the wave function collapses. And I thought that was a physical process. But then the argument was that that physical process doesn't follow the Schrodinger equation. It's something new. We still don't understand it. In my view, it's the big major unknown in physics.
And do you think it is that uncertainty, that the idea that, so much is unknown, that unsettles so many academics about what you're saying?
It could well be, yes. It gets people uncomfortable. They think particularly with quantum mechanics, because you've got to learn it, you see, and you learn these things and you get used to it and you think, yeah, I got the idea, I see how to do the Schrodinger equation, how you form these superpositions, and then you've got to do a measurement thing, yes, and you can see what the rules are. And they stop worrying about the fact that these things are incompatible. The measurement process is not following the Schrodinger equation. I mean, it's completely obvious. So why people don't say, you've got to do something about the subject? They're so impressed by the amazing things that the subject does. And that's absolutely true. Quantum mechanics does do amazing things. It does amazing things that classical physics could never have done. There's no question about that. But it doesn't mean that you have to take the whole thing with the dogma and the inconsistencies. You don't have to say, oh, well, this is just a puzzle, that the world is mysterious or something, and we will never understand it.
I mean, do you think artificial intelligence is a misnomer? That a computer cannot be intelligent because it has no consciousness. It can just do calculations.
I certainly agree with that. It's a terminology. It's too late because it's people call it AI and all that stuff. No, I think it's a misnomer. What the computers do is not intelligent. It can mimic intelligence. And, it plays chess very well and so on. Does it understand the game? I don't think so.
Before he died, Stephen Hawking warned about artificial intelligence, didn't he? And he said it would either be the best thing that ever happened to us or the worst. And he suggested it might be the last because the computers would take over and kill us all. I mean, it sounds like you think he's totally wrong on that.
Yes, I think he's totally wrong on that one. Yes, no, he can be wrong sometimes, as we all can. But no, he was certainly swallowing the common idea that computation was all there could be. And you see, it's not an unreasonable position to take, because what else is there? And if you're going to follow my route, it is pretty exotic, because I say it's not just quantum mechanics, it's where quantum mechanics, or our current theory of quantum mechanics, goes wrong. It goes wrong with the collapse of the wave function, because quantum mechanics is self-inconsistent at that point. People just get tied up in knots with this. They're so impressed with quantum mechanics, rightly so, because it is an amazing subject. But they're so impressed with it, they just say, well, the mysteries in it are just mysteries we'll never understand. They don't say, well, look, these mysteries are things which are beyond quantum mechanics. It's a wonderful theory, but it's not the be-all and end-all about physics. There's something missing from the subject. And the fact that there's something missing, I regard as pretty overwhelmingly. Lots of people don't believe me, but in my view, it's overwhelming the case for that. On the other hand, what is that something missing? What's going on in the brain? Now, that's a much trickier subject. You've got to find things in the brain which are at the level where the collapse can be used in a serious way. It's not just random with probabilities. There's some purpose to it, or whatever the right word is. I don't know whether purpose is the right word, but whatever it is that's involved in consciousness is coming. That's the basic, or the building block, put it like that. The OR part of OR, that is the objective reduction of the quantum state, is the building block of consciousness. It would probably, you see, Stuart Hameroff, he liked to call that consciousness. I think that was going too far. That's we can call it proto-consciousness, if you like. It's the building block out of which consciousness is constructed. but it's much too primitive. Consciousness is something much more subtle and has to be orchestrated, whatever orchestrated means, and it certainly does. The word is vague in that respect. Some sense brought together in a coherent way.
Do you think these gaps in understanding can ever be filled by computers, or must they always be filled by human thought?
They'll never be filled by computers. Well, you see, I mean, could a computer come about these things by chance? Well, you see, in a certain sense, you could say we've come about by chance. You see, after all, evolution has taken a long time, it has done, but in some sense, there are chance events, and the things which were more successful evolved and ultimately came around to producing us, if ultimately is the right word for us. But yes. And it wasn't purposeful in the sense of natural selection was saying, yes, I want to produce human beings. I don't believe that at all. It wasn't purposeful in that sense. So are we asking for how computers could come across a theory, in a sense, which in my view really requires understanding to come across? But could it come across it simply by chance? I mean, in principle, you could see it could, because like the monkeys and the typewriters, it could produce a book. And this book actually explains this amazing theory that we don't have, come about by a conscious being writing this book. But you see, theoretically, there's one chance in a trillion that this thing could produce this book by chance. Okay, but I think that's ridiculous. That's not the way it's going to come.
Can I ask you about your relationship with Stephen Hawking? How did that come about, and what did you make of how it was portrayed?
Well, it was curious in the film, because I'm supposed to be there. It's supposed to be me. It's nobody like me, but still giving a talk, nothing like one I would have given. But this was supposed to be the talk I gave in King's College London on the black holes, which was the singularities in black holes. So I did give a talk at King's College London. I remember being very pleased, but because J.L. Singh was there. He was a sort of geometrical relativity person I have a lot of admiration for, because I liked his books. They were all done from this geometrical perspective. And he was at the talk, not Stephen Hawking. However, Dennis Sharma heard about my talk, and he invited me to give a repeat of this talk in Cambridge, which I did. And Stephen was present at the repeat. The important thing was that afterwards, I had a private session with Stephen and George Ellis. I can't remember whether Brandon Carter was there, but for part of the talk, but George was certainly there. And I did describe in detail the techniques that I was using to prove the singularity result for the black holes. And Stephen very quickly picked up on these techniques. He certainly did. I mean, he understood them and used my argument in a cosmological setting. That's the first time it had been done this way, which was interesting. And then he generalized these techniques mainly to try and show that the Big Bang had to be a generic phenomenon. You can't get rid of it by making it complicated in some way.
Let me just briefly ask you about Escher and the ascending and descending staircase. How did you create that?
I was in my second year, I think it was, as a graduate student in Cambridge. And I decided I, with a colleague, would go to the International Congress of Mathematicians that was being held in Amsterdam. And I was just getting on a bus or a tram, I can't remember. And one of our lecturers, that was Sean Wiley, had in his hand a catalogue. And it had this picture on the outside, Escher's picture with the birds going into the night and the day in two directions and coming together with them being the gaps between the others in the middle. And I thought, that's amazing. What is that? And he said, oh, you'd be interested in this. There's an exhibition of this artist called Escher. I came away thinking, this is amazing. I'd like to try and do something impossible. So I fiddled around with roads and bridges. And then I simplified it to this thing which became known as the tribar, with these three rods at right angles to each other. And I showed my father this picture. And he showed it to various colleagues, and they all felt very ill looking at this picture. And then he produced this staircase going round and round. So we produced this paper, which we wrote, and Escher developed the staircase into his ascending and descending picture, very wonderful picture with the monks going around in the two directions. And then he produced Waterfall, which was based on the dry bar. But anyway, this was the influence that I'd had on Escher. He had a big influence on me too, so it was interesting.
Can I just ask you, I mean, given all the uncertainty that you acknowledge in science, do you allow for the possibility of God?
The problem is, see, what function does God play? Either he's the creator, in which case you'd have to identify him with the Big Bang or something. I now have a cosmology which doesn't have a Big Bang. Well, it has lots of them, if you like, but it doesn't have an origin of that nature. The other role that is played by God seems to be a moral one, that it gives you a moral direction and so on. But then when I think of the great religions in the world and how many of the wars that are being created by people fighting others who have maybe a religion which is just a little different from their own, it's appalling. How is religion stopping this sort of thing? It doesn't. Variants of the same religion often are the worst fightings against themselves almost.
So why doesn't it bother physicists that you don't have a creator? You know, that you don't know where it all started?
It's an interesting question, you see. I remember I used to talk to Stephen about this. His argument was, which I found in a way quite persuasive. I've gone against it since then, but I remember hearing his argument, which was that it's meaningless to talk about before the Big Bang, because there wasn't a before. Before is a temporal concept which only comes about when you have a universe. But you see, later on, in fact, not later on, I even described this model to Stephen. I had this model. There is a Big Bang. There was a Big Bang. Certainly the universe was very, very concentrated in a very tiny, squashed up state. But the model that I have is that when you have this extremely high temperature and density, that particles become effectively without mass. And if they're massless, they respect a different kind of geometry, which is what I call conformal geometry. So the argument is, hard to get your mind around, that's true, that this very, very rarefied, cold, infinite future becomes a Big Bang. It's difficult to get your mind around.
That must be a big inspiration for you to just carry on for as long as you possibly can, because there's nothing afterwards.
You see, it's not so clear. We don't really know that much about consciousness. I mean, we think it would be constrained to be in things like brains. We know it's present in humans. Pretty confident it's there in apes. Pretty confident it's there in dolphins. I think it's there in octopuses. I think there's a lot of evidence that octopuses are conscious. So it's there in different structures. Could it be there in other kinds of structures, which are not like the living beings that we know? Possibly. I have no idea. There is a question that's raised, which I have explored a little bit. And I don't want to stress this because it could be complete nonsense. You see, there is this thing called the SETI program, where people try to look for distant civilizations. And might they have been sending us signals to say, look, here we are, you see. Now, if you're going to find a highly developed civilization on a planet, well, you see, how far away do you have to look before you find them? It might be an awful long way. It might be there's not much chance, because to get to a stage where they will have reached enough technology that they can send us signals, maybe you won't find any within the range that we could possibly see. I don't know. It's worth doing, but it's not worth, say, wringing one's hand and say, atheism, give up. No. I don't see why there shouldn't be something much deeper about consciousness, which allows us to transcend ordinary mortality, as we think about it. We just know so little about it.
That's very interesting. If you could change anything about the world as it is, what would you change?
Well, I guess the topical issue is probably, in my view, also the most important one. I don't know how to change it. I mean, it's the global warming issue. The one thing that has slightly encouraged me about what's going on is the fact that the big corporations are beginning to think they've got to do something about it. But are there going to be technological developments? But I see this as a real challenge to humanity, and whether this is going to be resolved in time isn't obvious to me.
So that's the one.
Yeah, if I can call it one thing. Yeah.
So Roger Penrose, thank you very much indeed for your time. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Our producer was Nina Hodgson. All of these interviews are viewable on the Channel 4 News YouTube channel. Until next time, bye-bye.